Well, my paper titled Our Duty Towards Our Master. First, I don't know how to say thank you to everyone because I'm part of the organization, but definitely I want to thank my colleagues, organizers, and want to thank all the organizations that made this possible: Cankari Dom, Goethe-Institut, Faculty of Arts, and of course, the Aufhebung Association. Okay, let me begin. Even though there have been countless depictions of the effort put into the struggle between the master or the lord and the slave, the servant, the bondsman, as envisioned by Hegel, especially in the last 3 days probably, there is still some room to improvise and put forth a less glamorous probably illustration of this logic, but an illustration that should be in the last instance contribute to the understanding of the contemporary image of the master. But let us begin with a less obvious reference of the master and the servant logic. The renowned encounter between Jesus and Mary that nearly culminates in a touch was preceded by Mary's awestruck sight of her Rabboni, which is to say, master. This is from John chapter 20, verse 16. But the impetus for Jesus' return, for his sudden appearance behind Mary's back, could not have occurred without Mary's mourning, without her tears. Jesus was thus summoned by her affects, her weeping up the dead and recognizing him as the teacher, the master, the Lord. But for a slight moment, she misrecognizes him as the gardener, a servant of the burial ground. The latter is a less crucial detail that we might touch on later. However, crucially, Mary's servitude to the Lord or Jesus is particularly symptomatic in regard to the structure of master and servant logic. Any given master arises from such an emotional misrecognition, appearing firstly as a thing like any other. It is only through the mediation of a servant, not only through his work, labor for the master, but also through his tears, joys, that the master acquires his own pleasure. Now let us start by turning our attention to an example all too familiar to all of us. Perhaps the principal image that is bound up with Hegel, with his dialectical twists and his political theory, the encounter of self-consciousnesses on the battlefield of mutual recognition, which culminates in the introduction of the figures of the master and the servant, or the lord or the bondsman or the slave. This example, as is well known, in Hegel is presented in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit at the halfway point in the unfolding of consciousness from certainty to reason. Although it is one of the most famous episodes in the history of philosophy, the specificity of implications of our reading makes it worth briefly summarizing. The passages in question illustrate the winding path of consciousness to itself through various stages that begin with life in its pure state. We can say a state that does not hold within itself any enjoyment, or begierde, where only the sensory giveness is present, and concludes, of course, in actual self-consciousness. At this point of actualization, consciousness is bereft of sensual matter that held it in its own solitude and solipsism as it immerses itself in the interplay with other consciousnesses. The individual consciousnesses are initially staring each other face to face in the way ordinary objects do, as Hegel puts it in phenomenology. Since nothing has yet happened between them, they are simply immersed in the being of life, in self-feeling. This will be an important thing. Until they bring about the abstraction of immediate being and thereby stand on their own feet as self-consciousnesses, their independence is non-existent. The truth of their actions consists here only in presenting themselves as objects, as a way to express certainty of themselves. The only thing that holds the tension in place is thus this sensuous certainty, sinnliche Gewissheit. Therefore, the necessary next step in the construction of self-consciousness is the depiction of abstraction, which manifests itself as the pure negation of that objecthood in which the two are trapped. By removing everything external, all the determinations that are not a reflection of their doing, they are only able to affirm that they are not bound to any particular existence, since they act as pure beings for itself. And the tension reaches its peak here as the double needs to be removed and sublated. In this climax, in one fell swing, the battlefield for life and death with the other self-consciousness opens up. For certainty has been affirmed through the other and in the other, so in the other also. And this is probably also the reason that the most accurate depiction of this confrontation can be probably found in the low-budget horror cult film The Evil Dead, where the protagonist faces off with himself in a slapstick fight with his own possessed half, rather than something like Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, where the heroes are pitted against the villain and the music is in the background by Ennio Morricone, intertwined classically. So the renunciation of this double risk, of risking one's own head and the head of another, in whom one's being is presented as an externality, does not lead to perdition, since in this way one becomes an ordinary person. Rather, the choice to engage in life and death struggle seems pernicious, since certainty is in the last instance assured only in dying. Both self-consciousnesses eliminate themselves by eliminating the other self-consciousness. Thus, in the end, the winner is left with less than nothing, of course, because through the abstract negation, what is left is only a dead unity, a submergence in the consciousness of things. And famously, this experience shakes up one of the self-consciousnesses in its being, since, as Hegel puts it, life is as essential to it as self-consciousness itself. And this is, of course, not without consequences. The first self-consciousness, which is attached to life, cannot endure negation. The relationship is therefore transformed by this encounter. It is no longer equal, as one self-consciousness is now confronted by a consciousness that appears in the form of an objecthood or thingness. The self-autonomous self-consciousness now assumes the role of a master, while the non-autonomous self-consciousness, which is subordinated to life, serves the role of a servant. In the simplest terms, a master is a master in that he refers to the object of desire, to the object which he is confronted, and to the consciousness for which the thingness or the independent being is what is essential. This independent being over which the master has sovereignty and power is held firmly by the servant, for his life depends on it. The servant, because of his servant being, is not able to negate things, to eliminate them, but is able to process, to rework, to manipulate them. And the master's primacy or mastery in this relationship rests precisely on this substitution in the form of servant's work, who takes over the management of the annoying external things for him, so that he can provide a way of bringing about their pure negation. In doing so, relegating the work, the master does away with them and in the same gesture satisfies himself in pleasure, since he is only concerned with being for itself. The servant is thus indirectly, through a chain of non-essential work, subjugated to the master, but it is only through this mediation, via the servant, that the master refers to the thing as such. Moreover, the servant not only works for the master, he must anticipate the master's wishes in his work and behavior. So as an example, in Altman's Gosford Park, a whodunit murder mystery, quite a good movie, the housekeeper, in disclosing the circumstances of the murder, explains in more detail, namely the essential role that the servant occupies in the relationship to the master. And I'm going to quote Helen Mirren, who was the housekeeper. What gift do you think a good servant has that separates them from the others? It's the gift of anticipation. And I'm a good servant. I'm better than good. I'm the best. I'm the perfect servant. I know when they are hungry and the food is ready. I know when they're tired and the bed is ready. I know it before they know it themselves. So normally, we would recognize in this the absolute subservience of the servant who lives only for the master's whims. But the idea here is more precise. The perfection shown by the servant is in fact a reflection of the fact that this is the master's doing. Thus, the master turns out to be consistent with his initial wager, as he radically abolishes the objecthood, all privileged modes of being, and settles down in a passivity whose equilibrium is supported by the servant's labor. And in hindsight, however, the other side of the relationship comes to the fore, as the master, in his eagerness to enjoy his idleness, made a slight miscalculation and threw away his independence. He thereby appeared as the opposite of what he wanted to be. Meanwhile, the servant, in executing his work, acquires the opposite of what he immediately is, true independence. The master now functioned as a doll converted from his corpse, which the servant unknowingly drives on. A more familiar depiction of the servant's role can be probably found in Tarantino's Django Unchained, where the house slave, Stephen, is one who articulates the outrage at the sight of a free slave, Django, riding on a horse, instead of the master himself. The bond of the slave to his master is so strong in that sense that even upon his master's death, the house slave runs to the body and cries frantically. And in this tragicomic scenario, what is essential is that the experience of life and death struggle, an encounter with pure negativity, leaves a mark on the servant. It is not only a fear for this or that limb, or this or that particular moment, but a fear for the servant's whole being. A feeling of, as Hegel puts it, fear of death, this absolute master. And the sight of death, the experience of pure nothingness, manifests itself sensual experience in which Hegel subjectivizes the essence of the substance. The absolute negativity, the universal dissolution from natural existence, which let us stress once again, the servant achieves exclusively through work, expresses all the intricacies of a dialectical logic. And it was in this respect that Alexander Kojève was right when he declared that, quoting him, to speak of the origin of self-consciousness is necessarily to speak of a fight to the death for recognition. For Kojève, the struggle to death is therefore a struggle for pure prestige that functions in terms of desire directed towards another desire, that is to say, desire for recognition. And in retrospect, this twofold encounter of the servant with the master, the particular one in the individual struggle for recognition and the absolute one before which his whole being trembles, becomes the means of endowing the servant with a working consciousness in which desire will evaporate and be replaced by servitude. As already mentioned, things, of course, turn out differently for both the master and the servant. And also in Kojève's hands, the master is unceremoniously, non-dialectically executed, a fate so unceremonious that the twilight of the master is mentioned only in a footnote. And Kojève puts it, the master is simply killed and he dies as a master. That's like his fate. The servant's nature, on the other hand, acquires an exclusive rights over dialectics, but his prospects seem as hopeless as the latter's. He quickly casts off his pure capacity to work and merges it together with the capacity to conceptualize his own death and thereby overcome it. So the same pitfalls that made the master fall from grace, ambiguous sublation of otherness, now stands as the driving force of self-emancipation, the emancipation from finitude and the absolute master. Now, if Kojève was aiming at the right impasse, registered in the overlapping of death and desire, he probably missed the fact that fear of death is not a solitary effect, as it is woven together with anxiety and even resentment, which forms one of the foundations of the uneven relationship between the master and the servant. So just to recap Hegel's own presentation of the deadlock between the master and the servant, the exchange between master and the servant is reciprocal, the former enjoying the products of labor and the latter feeling the effort of this labor. The master, by mediation, also receives all the products of these relationships, including, and crucially for us, feelings. Thus, the feeling of fear, which drives one to the edge of this metaphysical precipice, does not touch the master. This anxiety is all the more pronounced in the case of the servant, of course, as his own being is shaken to the core. But in this existential drama, he is firmly supported by the work that is forced upon him. And the result seems emancipatory. As Hegel points out, quoting Hegel, in this service, he, the servant, sublates all of the singular moments of this attachment to natural existence, and ending to this a little bit on, through work, the servile consciousness comes round to itself. The master has based this consciousness of the object of desire, which, by its pure nature, maintains a certain self-feeling. So there's still a self, like I said at the beginning, the self-feeling that is supposed to be just at the beginning of the struggle, present as something which is unwanted in a sense, is still present as the core principle of the master. And this is an important detail to which we will return later. In this way, satisfaction is expressed as a mere disappearance because it cannot settle on an object. For the servant, on the contrary, through work, desire expresses itself as a repressed desire, which tames the disappearance so that the negative relationships towards the object becomes his form of realization. In stepping out of itself, the work servant consciousness gains independence for the object through work and formation, but by doing this, it importantly also gains independence for itself. Now we have in front of us a self-conscious servant to whom the object offers stability, even if he is held by the image of a master whose shadow weighs a ton, and who the servant seems to be the only one in the pair committed to feelings. However, it should be pointed out that the servant's object of work and formation is not only a sign of firm positivity, because, according to Hegel, it contains within itself that first moment of fear which drove the servant himself from the battlefield. That other being for itself of the master before which he trembled in fear thus becomes information for him as his own servant, of course. He internalizes this fear as now and is now able to become aware of it through reflection. And here Hegel importantly adds, without formation, which is here accompanied by, of course, labor, fear remains internal and mute, and consciousness does not itself become for it. So only fear can sober up a servant's head, and he can become his own head and single-headed. Meanwhile, the master is not too bothered by the servant's path of self-discovery, which, on the positive side, also allows for a certain distance to be maintained between them. So in order to fully justify the place of sensuality in the relationship between the servant and the master, it is probably helpful to read this section in the Phenomenology of Spirit on the emergence of this duo, dialectical duo, together with Hegel's later works. In Hegel's Science of Logic, we can thus find the following remark. Hegel says that the living things have the prerogative of pain. As it is through pain, Hegel emphasizes that the living natures discover that they are in themselves the negativity of themselves, and that their negativity exists for them. For the servant, fear for life is no longer enough to achieve self-consciousness, as there is a certain amount of pain required, pain that can only be embedded in labor and formation. The emancipating moment of labor is thus the result of hard work that the master does not invest, even though it is only through work that he exists. This would probably be a critique of UBI, probably. The reason, of course, is that the master is not on the side of life, since he is only interested in the pleasure of eliminating independent being and being recognized for it. The radical nature of this stance culminates in Hegel's philosophy of right, where the master, as a monarch, is reduced to a bare signature, but his name, of course, is essential. This reading of the relationship between master and servant clearly shows that the key moments are all an immediate manifestation of emotional affections, fear, desire, enjoyment, whereby sensuality and perception are through the mediation of reflection transformed into their otherness, into the order of reason. And it is not a surprising reading, since it can be found, for example, in Hegel's contemporary Karl Rosenkrantz, according to whom, in Hegel's hands, affects overlap with the activities of the mind, and thus the senses are already colored by thinking, and thinking is infused with feelings. This creates an appearance of a system that promotes the rationality of feeling, which, contrary to all philosophies that recognize in feeling the unity of inner life, the core of spiritual functioning, because they proceed from the premise that feeling is a function that is superior to the concept. It is not surprising, therefore, that a proper exposition of Hegel's subjective spirit, in which senses, feelings, and others are placed, is usually absent from discussions, since it has been obscured by the glamour of speculative logic. But before drawing any final conclusions, we necessarily need a bit of a context regarding Hegel's changing nature of feelings. Affects, namely, have their own field of operation within his system. As we have pointed out, the concept of life is itself a key element in Hegel's inquiry into the relationship between the two consciousnesses. However, the second aspect of life opens up an additional perspective as it is concerned with corporality and its emotional dimension. Hegel himself points out, a few decades after publishing the Phenomenology of Spirit in the Encyclopedia, how the idea can only be actualized in itself in the body, in which it is not only life, but existence ex spirit. Or, as he puts it a few hundred pages later in the same work, the body is the middle term by which I come together with the external world. So, if I want to actualize my aims, then I must make my physical body capable of carrying out this subjectivity into external objectivity. And even more specifically, in the section on anthropology, the body becomes the sign of the soul, the externality in which it feels itself, relating only itself and setting the stage for the higher awakening of the soul to the I. This individualization of life, which is not only a function, reattaches Hegel's philosophy to the contingencies of the world, and in relationship with the latter establishes a space of agency and work. A similar conceptual shift can be traced back to Kant, who considered the body essential in the structuring of thoughts or in the constitution of consciousness under the premise that thought cannot be separated from corporality. But this, of course, in no way implies that it is necessary to renounce the metaphysical primacy of reason itself. On the other hand, it only acknowledges bodily sensations as essential in constructing a reasonable reality and thereby reaffirms the exclusivity of the servant's role in establishing the field of self-consciousness. But of course, on the other hand, the banishment of body in favor of the plight of consciousness returns to affect the self with unforeseen ferocity, most prominently in the form of course, anxiety about its entire essence when confronting the other, or in its extreme form, trembling the depths of the self while risking her life. In his Anthropology, Kant stunningly almost repeats this climax of the struggle for recognition when he highlights the horror of death that the individual is faced with. The difference probably is that Kant is more precise at the void of the death, as he equates it with the void of sensation. And quoting Kant here, the void of sensations we perceive in ourselves arouses a horror, and as it were, the presentiment of slow death, which is regarded as more painful than when fate suddenly cuts the thread of life. It therefore seems that feelings are inseparable from even the most speculative endeavors. However, such affects don't have to reflect metaphysical impasses, as they are also present in more mundane circumstances. For example, crying, through which, according to Hegel, quoting Hegel, in crying, the pain is transformed, is excreted by the soul from its corporality. A few years ago, a book was published whose title captures probably the best way this aim of this talk. The book by Laszlo Fuldeni was titled Dostoevsky Reads Hegel in Siberia and Bursts into Tears. Somewhere Deleuze says that a philosophy that causes no tears, no one to cry, is worthless. And in regard to the book mentioned, several biographies highlighted that Dostoevsky managed to get his hands on a few books during his time in Siberia. But only the only author who is mentioned in all of these biographies by name is Hegel. And the premise of this book rests on a speculation of a source that the book in question was the lectures on the philosophy of world history, and that the tears were a reaction to Hegel's absolute devotion to reason. For instance, the aforementioned book mentions one of Hegel's passages as, reason cannot stop to consider the injuries sustained by a single individual, and continues for a particular ends are submerged in the universal end. And of course, for Dostoevsky, the radicalism of this principle rests on his own traumatic experience of suffering, death, and defenselessness of men, which is presumably in stark contrast with Hegel, for whom we must look away from all affairs that are not of reason, for all that is not subject to the master, and from everything before which man is helpless. Himself, stuck on the outside, Dostoevsky, stuck on the outside of the universal festivities of the history of reason, he felt that, of course, hypothetically, within this book, the dread of nothingness. Overwhelmed, he could do nothing but weep, or, as he puts it, the alternative presented by the book, write and rebel, as embodied by his fictionalized memoir, House of the Dead. However, perhaps in this depiction, Hegel is given too much of a burden. On the contrary, isn't it Hegel, as we have already introduced with the relationship between master and servant, who takes the trouble to persevere all the forms of spirit, the tensions and the excesses that are manifested in the development of the mind or the reason, in the demand for recognition and in the relation to things that are bound with it, are to a certain extent already imprinted in the very science of knowledge, which Hegel opens up not by depriving the experience of sinnlicher Gewissheit of its dignity, but not by brushing it aside, but rather taking it seriously and necessarily as any other form of reason. There is, of course, a place for reflection on the structural place of rebel and blunting of the labor process. But if Dostoevsky wept, he did so for the right reason, we could say, the dread of nothingness, but with a misplaced emphasis. Alternatively, we can offer a speculative reading of this incident. It would refer to the explication of logic in the early passages of the Encyclopedia, where Hegel points out to the scope of dialectics by highlighting how, quoting Hegel, even feeling, bodily as well as mental, has its dialectic, and immediately adds, everyone knows how the extremes of pain and pleasure pass into each other. The heart, overflowing with joy, seeks relief in tears, and the deepest melancholy will at times betray its presence by a smile. In this context, it would have been more likely that there was a glimmer of hope that sparked Dostoevsky's cry. It is namely well known that the Russian readers and students saw in Hegel's lectures an intoxicating and even prophetic value. Especially the idea that by reading history, one could become acquainted with the plan of providence, the reason of God, was very influential in Russia. However, there is also a more agreeable reading, if you refer to emotional tensions present in the relationship between master and servant. Crying in Hegel's philosophy is not just a random physical effect. In crying, Hegel puts it, again, Encyclopedia, in crying one externalizes the inner tearing apart of the sensing person caused by a negative, the pain. For the servant, fear for life is no longer enough to achieve self-consciousness, as there is a certain amount of pain required. Pain that can only be embedded in labor and formation. And these characteristics are of no concern to the master, who therefore doesn't have any reason to cry. But let us shortly return to the function of the body. The body is there for a simple reason: for cessation not to crumble away and life to persist. The servant himself, fearing death, is aware of that. Meanwhile, the master's relationship to this precarious situation is less clear in the phenomenology of spirit. Fortunately, we can again help ourselves again with the Encyclopedia. The body is volatile and in need of a structuring principle. And control of the body can be realized only in the embodied individual as, again, self-feeling. Feeling of oneself, which is a result of a specific process in relation to nature that establishes certainty for a particular individual. In the context of self-feeling, Hegel is explicating the soul in which, quoting Hegel, the subject as such posits its determinations in itself as its feelings. I already mentioned the detail that the master has presented in the phenomenology of spirits in holding himself together by negating the object and thus preserving self-feeling. Okay. But it is important insofar as it shows how the master is in this logical procedure and in contrast to the servant, immersed in the particularity of this sensation. The master follows the particular image of the subject and, quoting Hegel again from the Encyclopedia, at the same time as he posits these determinations in itself, joins together with itself as subjectivity one in those feelings. And even though we saw that the master was caught up in the struggle for recognition, he is determined by this particularity of feeling. However, if the master is left fixated on this particular feeling, then we are giving the master over to madness. Then what else is madness than the fixation in a particular determination, or, as Hegel puts it again in the Encyclopedia, thing of the finitude that is held within it. Now we can say that the master is no longer just stupid, as Zizek put it a couple of days ago, but he is also crazy and mad. This insistence on a particular over-determinating feeling is perhaps the reason that the master never cries, never falters, or questions himself. He is caught in his own asocial world that nonetheless, as we have shown, needs another as the thing and an other consciousness for which the thingness is essential. While the master seems oblivious to the happening of the servant who can freely commune in their everyday life, the servants themselves are fundamentally tied to the expression of feelings as a sort of a social bond, a bond between the servants that rests on the fear of death and the pain of work, but a bond nonetheless. And it is precisely at this point that the figure of the contemporary capitalist master harbors a certain risk to this social bond as such. To shed away the clothes of start worrying about work and feelings of others would be like the way that the contemporary master is trying to establish his own mastery. And let us not forget that Hegel was largely inspired by Aristotle in conceptualizing the relationship between the master and the slave. Admittedly, the relationship is, of course, less subtle, having the master as the bearer of reason and the slave as the purveyor of affects. But in this manner, the stakes are quite clear. One has reason, the other one has feelings, and they can coexist quite well together. But for example, for a capitalist master, readily makes use or refers to let's say, so-called emotional intelligence, which relies on empathy and social skills. And I would say that the personification of this figure is Elon Musk, who may not have an empathy for individual workers, but all of his endeavors are undertaken for the survival of the humankind. So in a sense, he has an empathy for the humankind. And this is why a contemporary or a recent development, this is why the protesters in Iran have been chanting for Elon Musk to come to their aid. If you haven't heard that. However, the social bonds are premised on the work and tears of the servants and on the idea of master's exclusion from life and his lack of concern for it. So the duty of the slave, the servant, and the worker is therefore to relieve the master of the burden of empathy, of feeling, and acting upon this sentiment. You either have an insensitive master or you have something worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Goran. Great, and thank you also for sticking to the time limit. Yeah, we didn't talk about it, but I think your paper echoed in mine and the other way around. We didn't know. Some questions? Yes, please. And Peter? The three of you, okay. Somebody else? Bojana? Okay, cool.
Early in your talk, you brought up fear, desire, and enjoyment, all three being involved in the master-slave relation. So I didn't catch how desire works for the master. And if you can also talk about enjoyment, that would be even better.
If I may join?
Definitely.
Excuse me. This
I hope
relates
it's not the
to
same question.
This is the same question in a way. First of all, thank you for this presentation. And I think my suggestion would be, why did Dostoevsky cry? Just this morning I was going through some books on swearing and cursing. And there's an analogy between crying and swearing, apparently. There are many authors who insist on that. So when somebody is frustrated, he could say, fucking Hegel. I mean, this would be suggestion, so, and cry. You also mentioned that by developing your argument that a servant must somehow anticipate master's wishes, and this relates to the question Francis posed. And I think there are many interesting issues here. The first question is, does the master know what he wants? And there's always a supposition that what does he want? And if I'm not mistaken, Slavoj developed in one of his Slovenian books, Jezik ideologija Slovenci, at the end of the 80s, following Mladen's concept of the sujet supposé jouir, also subject supposed to enjoy, also category subject supposed to desire. So is the master supposed to know how to desire, or whether we should follow Lacan that master in fact does not know, because there's a split subject at the place of the truth in the master's discourse? And if you can, I mean, there are many also associations with that. If I'm not mistaken, I tried to Google it out, but I wasn't able. It was Sex Pistols who said, we don't know what we want, but we know how to get it. So this is interesting. And if you are relating to some film and popular cultural material, there's also an interesting serial. Back then, 20, 30 years ago, You Rang, My Lord, where there's a figure of the butler who knows every wishes, and there's, yes, my lord, of course. And the interesting thing is that the butler itself is doubled in two figures, one which is cunning and kind of tricky, and the other who is loyal and somehow naive. So that I would just relate to the questions pertaining to Francis. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I like the example of Yes, My Lord, but I think that this, okay, it's a more contemporary example, but in Django Unchained, one character encompasses, embeds, or manifests both aspects of this relationship. So Samuel L. Jackson playing this Stephen, the house slave, is doing both things at once. That's why I like it better. You don't need two characters, you have redoubled character in itself as one. Samuel L. Jackson, I think this is the only one who can do something like that. But I think he's doing exactly that. Related to the question about desire, I think that like the simplest answer, really the simplest answer related to desire is really just the desire of to get rid of otherness, in a sense. That is like the starting point of consciousness. How to relate its own certainty is by exterminating, in a sense, eliminating, and so on, everything that is outside itself. That's why you have like the struggle, which happens precisely because of the impasse embedded into the first self-consciousness, who gets to know the other self-consciousness, who has the same idea, in a sense.
Okay.
There's a sub-question.
A sub-question,
Yeah.
okay.
So I just didn't understand where desire came into that description of destroying otherness.
It's the desire for the elimination of the objecthood, not just one object, but objecthood as such.
Oh, so it's not desire as we normally think of it.
It is, but not for the master.
Because usually desire
it is, but not for
for
the master. I think
Okay.
that's the specific. The master has like his specific way of doing his work. His being a master makes him a special kind of, not human, not even a subject, but a master.
So this master
But that's why he doesn't
desires-
even, that's why I think, oh, sorry, really sorry. But that's why, like I did mention, he doesn't cry, he doesn't care. I think that's like, you need desire to do all of that. While
It's not desire for anything
No.
except for elimination of objects. Okay, thank you.
Okay, just now we have quite some questions. So Arthur, then Bojana, then I don't know your name, then Yuval and Frauke. So I suggest, and I think this will be it. I suggest that maybe we go 2 by 2, like 2 questions you
Yeah, of
answer
course,
that
of
will
course.
a little bit speed up. So Arthur and then Bojana. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It was a fantastic paper. I wanted to ask a question about the crying master and whether it's true that the master doesn't cry or can't cry. Just 2 footnotes to your paper, really. I mean, firstly, the scene with Mary that you mentioned at the beginning is a repetition of an earlier scene at the house of Simon the Pharisee, where the woman weeps at the feet of Jesus and washes his feet with tears. So it's a kind of the tears are a symbolic acknowledgement of Jesus's sovereignty. However, jump forward to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare writes a play called Richard II, in which he reverses this thing, where it's not the slave or servant crying over the master, where the master is in tears throughout the entire play. And actually, perversely, even at the moment of his deposition, it's a play about the overthrow of Richard II. He uses his own tears as a kind of way of reasserting his mastery. And if I remember correctly, he says, "With my own tears I wash away my balm." So only the true sovereign can wash away my sovereignty. So it's almost like the master steals the servant's tears, the subject position of the servant, in order to reinforce their mastery. So he's kind of Elon Musk, avant la lettre, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Can I just?
Yeah, of course.
No, because like the example that you give, I have it written down. I didn't give it from Luke. Yeah. The difference in that example from Jesus, what happened, of course, she came there, washed his feet with tears and so on, is that he's not the master there. I think that's like for me, the main difference. Because after that, of course, he needs to die, he needs to come back, and after that, he's really the master, the Lord, and so on. We can say he's a prophet. He's a prophet, he's not a master, I would say.
You want to comment?
He's a servant. Servant of God, servant
Okay.
of... He needs to die. He needs to die to be the Trinity and so on. So it doesn't matter. He didn't die. Yeah, of course. There's a prophecy there, but he's still the prophet then.
Okay, for later. Okay. Bueno.
Okay. This
Theological.
functions. Okay. Thank you for the talk, Goran. I'm interested in the transition you mentioned from the asymmetric structure of the thought figure of master-slave in Hegel to the idea of life. If I just put it bluntly, this master-slave figure, okay, we have a master who enjoys pure thought for the sake of pure thought itself, and then also enjoys recognizing his own enjoyment in pure thought. So in the end, he enjoys his own name, let's put it bluntly. And then we have the moment of thought figure of servant, who is necessarily bound to self-externalization of his own subjectivity. He cannot enjoy it directly in terms of work, of making products. So the idea of life, the way Hegel defines it, at least in the science of logic, shows a similar structure to this one. He says explicitly, life is organic nature, out of which concept arises, but as blind, as the one that cannot and must not see itself. So I'm interested if this, if this transition, would you say, if it is a transition at all, because we have a kind of replication, or what changes, let's put it like this, what changes, because we have, it seems so, a replication of asymmetry in the field of organic nature. Thank you.
Okay, but I'm sorry, but we'll go 2 by 2 because we have to a little bit to speed up. Yeah. So another question, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. I just have one comment about what you said about Elon Musk and Iran, and because right now, of course, the situation in Iran is, I think there is kind of reductionism in what you said about what's going on in Iran. If you remember, Lenin also was vehemently criticized because of the train that German, facilitated his trip to go back to Russia. Right now, the whole internet in Iran is shut down. There is no any accessibility to let's say phone, or and I think this is first of all, there is no really a huge amount of, let's say, calling for Elon Musk to come to help Iranian people. Right now, people are taking the street. If, according to what you said, if the absolute master is the fear of death itself, not supreme leader or monarch, I think this time there is a tectonic shift in the series of Iranian massive protests over past, let's say, at least 10 years. This time people are transgressing this, let's say, this fear of death, as Adorno nicely put it times ago, that revolution is revolution against fear. I think,
sorry, can you just speed up?
Just wanted to mention that, that the situation is much more complex, unfortunately, because the lack of information and misrepresentation of the protests there, this kind of reductionism is really, it's some kind of that. It puts the whole situation in danger. I mean, it puts that protest or that movement in danger. Sorry, just wanted to mention this.
Thank you. Thank you. Goran, please, try to pack it.
Okay. I think because Bojana's question is quite extensive, we can talk afterwards, if it's okay. Okay. But the Elon Musk question, I think it's a structural problem. It's not like, of course, it's a reduction, but it's a reduction which exemplifies what, in the end happened. You had different protests, and at the end, someone said, okay, let's see who can help us. And it was Elon Musk who was structurally there to offer help. It was not like, I don't know, in Ghostbusters, who is going to call Ghostbusters because you have a ghost. It was like, we're going to call not Lenin, but Elon Musk. It is, I understand that something else is happening. A couple of things are happening. The problem with the structural problem there is that there's not the alternative, but the answer to the problem is currently the wrong answer, I would say. And the answer is, currently, just for one day, I'm not saying this is the whole movement, is Elon Musk. I understand the internet is not working. Elon Musk has the answer to that. He can like provide the capacity of the small capacity for internet and so on.
The answer is also ambiguous for Iranian people.
Of course. But if you put an answer out, of course, I completely agree. But if one of the answers is Elon Musk, something is already going wrong. That's my answer to that.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean,
I'm not saying that this will embody the whole movement. I hope not. There was only one instance of that happened. But like the media grabbed that, and you know what happens. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Do you have maybe just like one sentence or two for Bojana?
No, I don't have just one sentence. That's why I asked her for.
Okay, is that okay, Bojana? Okay.
Yeah.
Then Yuval and Frauke, and we stop.
Okay, thank you, Goran. Congratulations. I have a whole thing, but this really for later about this word of Rabboni or Rav, but we can really talk about it later. I was intrigued by the notion of anticipation, and sort of want to invite you to think about the limits of it. And what I have in mind is that the entire sort of new fantasy of things like Amazon would be to get you what you desire before you desire it, right? You search something, and before you know that you need some product, it arrives at your home. Mm-hmm. And I think the obvious, like just on an immediate level, this does not position us in a position of masters, right? There's something really creepy, suffocating about that. And just so, what does that do to our way of refining or thinking about what proper anticipation would be? How it would. So this.
Thank you, Frauke.
Yeah, that is just a comment or a little like advice. There's a novel of the Swiss author Robert Walser, available in English translation. It's Jakob von Gunden, 1908. And that is actually about the economy of fear, anxiety, desire, and enjoyment. And the interesting thing is that this relationship is regulated by a contract between master and servant. And the servant, he considers himself a spherical zero, like Kugelrunde Null. And that fits so well to your talk, because that story maps desire on masochism. And there you can find desire that aims at both, at destroying objects, and master and slave are destroying each other as an expression of desire or as fulfillment of desire. So in the end, they die like a death of love or something like that. That might be interesting for you.
Thank you. Goran?
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Proper anticipation. It's a tricky question because, okay, you can go a couple of ways, but you'll have to give me just 10 minutes after that.
I'm anticipating.
No. I'm anticipating your reaction to this. I think that's the problem. But yeah, I'll anticipate further, and in 10 minutes I'll give you the answer.
Okay, is that fine?
Yeah. So the next question.
I think we stop here.
Yeah, because I didn't hear the author. I'll ask you afterwards.
It's, Robert Walser.
Okay.
Walser.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Applause for the interpreters. And now another applause for Goran, please.